Hi, my name is Ron Furstenau, and I'm here at First Lutheran Church doing a 3-lesson series on science and religion, and we're glad to have you with us today. This is the first of the 3 lessons. This is going to be an introduction to science and religion and getting you to think a little bit like a scientist, and we'll talk about some important terms that we're going to use over the 3 lessons, and we're going to talk about the conflicts and the complementary things about science and religion. On the second lesson, we're going to look at the science of some of the big things, such as cosmology and evolution. And then finally, on the third lesson, we'll look at some of the small things like atoms and molecules. As an introduction to me, I was a professional chemist for 32 years in the Air Force, 28 on active duty, and 28 years on active duty and 12 years as a civilian. And I consider myself more of a generalist than an expert on anything. I know a lot about a few things in chemistry, and I know a little about a lot of things. I'm not a philosopher or a theologian. I can't make really solid philosophical arguments about much of anything, but I am a proud Christian, and I see science as a way of more deeply understanding God. The physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne probably says it best, and I quote, "Science and faith are complementary paths to a fuller understanding of God." And from all the books I've read to prepare for this is probably the one that I agree with the most. My promise to you is I'm on these 3 lessons, I'll do my best so that you can understand science and religion as a bridge between discovery and faith. My goal is to strengthen your faith by helping you understand some of the scientific concepts and viewpoints that support my faith in God. Science is about how things work. Theology and philosophy are more about what things mean. It's important to realize that theology and science take on different questions and ask different questions. Because of this, some people believe that one of these has no bearing on the other. And as you can see, as we go through these 3 lessons, I have a different opinion on this. Curiosity is something that's very valued in both science and religion. And science, theology, and religion, in my part, are all searching for the truth. And curiosity is part of that truth. To support the curiosity part, I provided some questions for thought to accompany each of these 3 lessons. And it works best if you glance at these questions beforehand, before you watch the videos, and then look at them afterwards to develop your own answers to these questions. I've also compiled a reading list that you would be helpful to look at before watching these videos, and they provide a lot of different viewpoints on regarding science and religion. One thing to remember as we go through this, and I'll say this more than once, is that the Bible is not a science book. And this is not a seminar to try to use science to prove things that are written in the Bible, such as Moses parting the Red Sea and Jesus changing water into wine. As far as I'm concerned, those things are miracles, plain and simple, and you either believe them or you don't. Now we're going to spend just a little bit of time so you can understand the science part of science and religion a little bit more. We're going to kind of get you to think like a scientist. I'd like to read from you the official position of the National Academy of Sciences with respect to religion and science. And I quote, "Religions and science answer different questions about the world. Whether there is a purpose to the universe or a purpose for human existence are not questions for science. Science is a way of knowing about the natural world, but it's limited to explaining the natural world through natural causes. Science can say nothing about the supernatural. Whether God exists or not is not a question about which science is neutral." Let me demonstrate what it means to think like a scientist. And the simplest example I can think of is this balloon. One of the things that we get good at as scientists is asking why things do what they do. And we're going to use this balloon as a simple example. When I inflate the balloon, you might wonder, well, why does it do this when I blow air into the balloon? Someone may say, well, when you blow air into the balloon, you're increasing the pressure of the gas inside of the balloon. And that's true. But then I would take this one step further and then ask, why is there pressure? What's causing the pressure? And it comes from the fact that the air molecules are moving. They have mass, They're moving, we really don't know why they do, but we know that they do. So they're banging around and they're trying to get out. Because they're moving, they have mass, they're hitting the sides with some force per unit area, and it's the motion of the molecules, that force per unit area, that's causing the pressure. That's how scientists think about a balloon. So you're becoming a scientist gradually here. Science relies on asking questions and searching for answers. Establishing facts, that's a very important part for scientists to make progress. For example, about 125 years ago, many scientists did not believe in the existence of atoms and molecules, right? And nowadays, with what we understand in those last 125 years, if you don't believe in the concept of atoms and molecules, you're just plain wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It doesn't matter what a talking head says on TV or what a politician might say. Atoms and molecules are real, right? It is, however, reasonable to ask questions. Well, how do we know atoms and molecules exist? Or what experiments have been done to prove the existence of atoms and molecules? Those are reasonable science questions to ask. And it's always acceptable to revise scientific theories when evidence comes along to contradict these theories. For example, the laws of thermodynamics and Newton's laws of motion are theories that have withstood the test of time, and they accurately allow us to predict things. Our modern understanding of the structure of the atom, however, has undergone lots of revisions over the last 125 years to get to the understanding that we have today. Along these lines, philosopher and theologian J.P. Moreland maintains that science, and I quote, has done more to confirm the Christian's God existence than to undermine it. And science has provided little or no evidence against belief in God. Science has, however, raised challenges to various biblical texts, and Christians need to take these challenges seriously. Moreland estimates that 95% of science is irrelevant to theology. 3% of science evidence supports theology, whereas 2% of science challenges interpretation or inerrancy of Scripture, though not its core teachings. It's very important, this is very important to remember. For example, whether you believe in atoms or molecules or not really doesn't have anything to do with theology. There are some important terms that we're going to be using throughout these three lessons. Maybe the most important one that you may not be familiar with is something called scientific materialism. It's also known as simply materialism or physicalism. This scientific materialism holds that the only matter exists and all things are explainable in terms of matter alone. Whether things are dead or alive, they are simply atoms and molecules. If you knew enough about the present state, the energy and motion of every atom in the universe, which by the way you can't, but if you did, you could predict the future outcome of matter. In other words, scientific materialism holds that everything is predetermined once the universe was formed, and it's simply by the natural motion of atoms. And again, materialism, physicalism, and realism mean something very, very similar to that. We are nothing more in those terms than biological machines whose mental activity is simply the result of neurochemistry. Matter and forces acting on matter, that's all there is. Now, the term scientism takes this one step further, and it's a term used by J.P. Moreland in his book, Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology. Scientism says that only science provides us with true knowledge, or, and I quote, the view that the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of reality. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is, at least according to scientism, based on private emotions, blind faith, or cultural upbringing. Right? Moreland contends that there are several ways of knowing, and that theology, science, and other fields provide us with genuine knowledge. In Moreland's view, and I agree with him, the concept of scientism is really a philosophy itself and not science. There are another term that I think it's important to be familiar with which many Christians may also be familiar with already, is substance dualism. And that's the traditional Christian view that human beings are immaterial souls integrated with a physical body. And this view stands opposed to the physicalism view that I outlined before, that says human beings are nothing more than the sum of their physical parts and biological processes. There are certainly, as most people know, conflicting views about science and religion, and I kind of want to point those out to you here, and I'm going to point out a couple of extremes here, but it's important to realize what these extremes are. And I want you to ask yourself when I read these, which of the following viewpoints most accurately reflects your current views about science and religion? This quote is from Nobel Prize-winning physicist and atheist Steven Weinberg, and I quote, "I am all in favor of a dialogue between science and religion, but not a constructive dialogue. One of the great achievements of science has been, if not to make it impossible for an intelligent person to be religious, then at least make it possible for them not to be religious. We should not retreat from this accomplishment." The second viewpoint that I wanted to give you is from physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne, and he says, "Science and religion are friends, not foes in the common quest for knowledge." Some people may find this surprising, for there's a feeling throughout our society that religious belief is outmoded or downright impossible in a scientific age. I don't agree. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that if people in this so-called scientific age knew a bit more about science than many of them actually do, they'd find it easier to share my view. And one of my goals in these 3 lessons are to give you a little bit more about the science so you can understand the relationship, the complementary relationship between science and religion. Another view I found that's similar to Steven Weinberg's view, we can find in the book Faith versus Fact, Why Religion and Science Are Incompatible by Jerry Coyne. And he says, nevertheless, is it possible to have a constructive science and faith dialogue? My response is that anything useful will come from a monologue, one in which science does all the talking and religion does all the listening. Further, the monologue will be constructive only for the listener. While scientists can learn more about the nature of belief by talking to the faithful, these benefits can accrue to anyone who wants to learn more about religion. In contrast, religion has nothing to tell scientists that can improve their trade. Indeed, the progress of science required shedding of all vestiges of religion, whether those be the beliefs themselves or religious methods for finding the truth. Continuing this quote, Jerry Coyne says, "I have argued that religion is to science as superstition is to reason. Indeed, that is the very reason they are incompatible. Irrationality enters when religion's truth claims are based on reason and not any kind of systematic investigation, but on faith, belief in matters for which there is no convincing evidence," unquote. I don't think that the last part of Coyne's statement about faith is true. There's been plenty of systematic investigation, as he puts it, and evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, as well as eyewitnesses to the resurrection. As is true for many atheists who write books on the incompatibility of science and religion, Coyne seems to know a reasonable amount of the different religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Mormonism, etc. But he really understands nothing about the Christian beliefs about faith and grace and the redemption through Jesus Christ and what those things actually mean. He really doesn't understand any of that. To me, he views science as a religion in itself. He believes in scientism, as I talked about before, right? We're going to be exploring, however, the questions that science and religion raise, but we're going to see the compatibility between these throughout these lessons, right? Religion, let me point out a few quotes that I really think are important to understanding science and religion that they are complementary. John Van Sloten is a pastor who's given many sermons with respect to God and the wonders of nature. Van Sloten looks at the world which God has created as another Bible. That is, a physical representation of the power of God. This is a common viewpoint of scientists who are believers as well, and is certainly my personal viewpoint. Science is our way of understanding the physical world, so as a result, we understand God better. Van Sloten has talked to a lot of other scientists in many scientific disciplines, and a cell biologist he talked to said, "What does my work tell me about God's nature and God's purpose for me in this world?" is how he goes about his work. Another one points out, scientists can't make discoveries happen. Discoveries simply reveal what was previously unknown. Like coming to faith, they surprise us because they were beyond us. I want to give a few other quotes here by some famous scientists over the centuries. In 1596, Johannes Kepler, he was an astronomer and a Lutheran, said, and I quote, "Those laws, that is planetary motion, are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us in his image." Isaac Newton believed that one of the principal goals of natural philosophy, which is science, was to formulate convincing arguments for the existence of God. Robert Boyle, who was one of the fathers of modern chemistry in the late 1600s, was a brilliant experimentalist, and he believed that nature was a legitimate source of knowledge about the mind of God, and he worked to understand this by experimentation. Going ahead a few hundred years, one of my favorite scientists is Max Planck, who was one of the early 20th century's greatest physicists and one of the founders of quantum mechanics, felt that theism and the natural sciences have the common goal of illuminating reality. And the ultimate truth toward those parallel streams is God. And that's really one of my favorite viewpoints on science and religion, that science and religion share the common goal of illuminating reality with the ultimate truth being God. And in the next two lessons, we're going to look at some of the areas of science that illuminate the astounding nature of God. We're going to start with big areas of science, followed by very tiny ones. I hope you'll join me on the next two lessons.